Welcome to On the Bubble Podcast, episode 67. I'm your host, Sabasa J. Ueda, and with me is my co-host, Yuki Lee Bender. Today's episode, we are going to be doing another FAB Fundamentals, talking about endgames. We're going to be talking about what is an endgame, how do we evaluate endgames, and once we do, what we can do to change our plays based on that new information. But before we do that, how's your week, Yuki? You played some PQs this season?
Yeah, I ended up playing one PQ into Tacoma. We were considering going to Portland as well, but the PQ finished like super late, and some of our plans on the way back ended up getting canceled. So we just, because we were planning to like go down to Portland, come back to Tacoma, hang out with some friends, and kind of do that. And that didn't end up happening. Those plans fell through, and it ended up being like, well, it's like a hotel, another 6 hours of driving just for one PQ. Maybe not. PQ went pretty well though. I played KO. There is a full write-up on the Patreon Discord. So there's a tournament reports channel in there, and you can check out the whole detailed write-up. But to give you a very brief summary, I played KO. I went 5-1 in Swiss, losing a KO mirror, and then I lost in semifinals to Akatsu. The game's actually on stream on Mindful Games YouTube. Really cool store in Tacoma. I think it's their first PQ. They had an awesome event, great prizing. The staff was super friendly. The scene was great. It was huge too. There was like 48 people at the PQ, so pretty big PQ. Yeah, had a great time. And basically the semifinals game I lost, I opened Castbones, CNC going second, and I rolled Scabs and I rolled a 1. Yeah, and then I got Katsu'd.
Oh, it was a Katsu versus KO? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Scabskin Leather is a powerful card, but if you roll a 1 on it, it could just lose you the game sometimes.
Yeah, it definitely could. I definitely was like, do I do this? Yeah, I think it's the correct play. The payoff is so big. Oops.
Lost your 50-50? I guess if you just roll a 2 or 3, it's fine too, right?
Yeah, if I roll a 2 or 3, like, it's less good for me, but like, I probably still have a chance in that game, but rolling the 1 is probably dying. So it's like, yeah, I have like a 17% to lose. But I think in that spot, if I roll a 6 and I can like double Castbones, Claw, Arsenal, CNC, pretty insane.
Yeah, that sounds like an insane turn.
Yeah. And even the 4, I'm not sure. It would probably depend on what I saw in the first Castbones, but I either like get a double Castbones, Arsenal, a CNC, or I get a Castbones, CNC them, and then like Arsenal, a Castbones. Yeah, probably depend what I saw off the top and if I have an agility, etc. But yeah, I thought the upside was like probably pretty game winning, and I'm like 50% chance to like not win the game, but like be super favored seems pretty worth it, and didn't work out. So yeah, overall pretty happy with the deck. Wasn't very different from the PT list. Deck list is posted once again, Patreon, Discord, tournament reports, and I will do an updated KO list for PQs now that Dromai is gone, so that will be coming out also on the Patreon. And once again, shout out to all of our patrons. We really appreciate you, and everything that you do for the show. And we also appreciate all of our listeners that aren't able to give back as well. So thank you everyone for listening and supporting us. It's amazing. Can't say thank you enough.
Yes, thank you very much for supporting us. And one more thing I want to talk about was what hero did you get? You top forward, right? So you got the hero for top fouring?
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, I got Betsy.
Oh, so the Rainbow Foil Adult Betsy?
Yeah, I think I heard that they had like 2 Kasai, 3 KO, 3 Betsy. I got Betsy. So in terms of monetary value, at least I low rolled.
Was it random how they're giving it out?
Yeah.
Do we know what gold foil got open at the event?
I don't know. I know so I know that Pankaj or Ethnic Smoke won the PQ on Kasai. I believe the top 8 was like 1 KO, 1 Katsu, a Kano, a Dromai, 2 Kasais, and a Hatchet Story.
I counted 7 there.
There was a Warrior Mirror. There was the Katsu bullied the Kano. I bullied the Dromai. And I don't know what the last matchup was.
Okay, that's fair. It's okay.
Well, anyways, 7. I believe it was only 1 Kano though, or sorry, only 1 KO though. So
yeah, very diverse metagame right now.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of like what you'd expect. Like I saw a lot of KO, I saw a lot of dual wield warrior, saw a fair bit of Prism, saw some Dromai. We won't be seeing Dromai going forward, but I think we'll continue to see Prism, dual wield warrior. Victor, maybe? Not sure. I feel like Victor kind of has like a little bit of a rough KO matchup, but the KO has to play like very, very well for that to be true. And at a lot of levels of play, it can be very close. And then KO is like pretty good into the dual wield warriors. And then the Kano matchup is also like theoretically pretty rough for Victor, but the Kano does need to know what they're doing. And sometimes the Victor can just kind of like smash them. So I don't know. I feel like Victor is like in theory not that good, but then still does well. Even at the PT and like the calling attached to the PT, there was just like Victor's doing well. So I think it's a pretty good PQ deck. Like I think to take advantage of it, people need to play really clean, and sometimes you can just still like clash and get people. So yeah, very good PQ deck. Just like force your opponents to play perfect, and you can still kind of high roll them.
Yeah, and with the new set, we get another Victor specialization too, right? That spoiler card was kind of cool, where you get just like it's a blue one cost go again card that makes a gold, so it just draws you a card if you play it for the first card as the first card of your turn. I thought that was pretty cool too.
Yeah, and then if you have 3 golds, it gives you +3, which is pretty crazy because your shield is already a gold and it gives you a gold. So if you've won one clash, it's just like a blue 1 for 3 go again draw card, which is pretty insane. Like it's just like not that hard to turn on because like the shield's a gold and it spots you a gold. So it's just like if you make 1 gold somewhere in the game, this thing is just online as like a really like hyper efficient card. And it's a blue.
What if we started with Crown of Dominion?
You could, yeah. If you start with Crown of Dominion, then you play this, that's your 3rd gold, and you're off to the races. So definitely pretty interesting. I think that if Victor wants to play this, there is a little bit of attention. I like that it's like not a 3 cost, so it doesn't fit with Titan's Fist. So you might be more incentivized to run Millers instead of Titan's Fist. It also like has some tension with like it doesn't turn on Rouse, it doesn't turn on Zealous, it's a miss on your clashes. So there are costs to running this card in your deck, and it may shape the if Victor wants to play this card, it may shape how the deck is built a little bit. It's sort of my guess.
Yeah, yeah, I think I agree with that. I think it's a really cool design on a Guardian card, honestly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that card. I that card makes me want to play Victor now. So
Yeah, it's super super powerful.
okay, let's move on to our main topic. And so, as I said in the beginning, we're gonna be talking about endgames today. So I guess let's get right into it and just ask, what is an endgame, and how do we know we are in an endgame scenario? Do you just want to describe that first?
Yeah, so I kind of think like game has like 3 main parts broadly speaking. It has like an early game, a middle game, and an end game. And I think the early game is the one that gets talked about the most. It's when you have like all or most of your equipment, your life totals are pretty healthy, you're not being forced to block anything unless you want to. Like you have full, like sometimes you have to block because the on hit's really scary, but like technically you could eat it and you wouldn't lose the game. This is kind of like the early game, and usually you play to maximize value. So this has been talked about a lot, but it's the idea of getting the highest numerical value of your block and your attack. So if you block for 6, you attack for 7. That is a 13 value turn. If you could instead not block and attack for 14, that would be a 14 value turn, and that 14 offense is better than the combined 6 defense and 7 offense. So typically in the early game, I think that value maximization really dictates the decisions that you make by and large. Like it's almost always right to go with the value positive play. In contrast, I think that kind of falls apart in the end game. So what is an end game? End game for me, and I don't think this is like super commonly agreed upon, but the way I think of an end game is it's when you are forced to block. So once you are forced to block attacks because you're going to take lethal, if you don't, you're in an end game scenario. Usually, this means you also have limited equipment available because your cards are being forced from hand. If you're able to give your armor, you're not quite in an end game. You're getting close, but you're not quite there. Sometimes you're at pitch stack for end games, but not always. Especially in aggro matchups, you might enter end games well before reaching your pitch stack. I think every game has an end game, regardless of if you go to second cycle, but often in longer matchups, second cycle or your pitch stack can be involved as well. But yeah, typically end games you might be forced to trade small hands back and forth. So if you're both in an end game, you might be trading like 2 card hands back and forth, and you kind of have that like lots of forced blocks playing as efficiently as you can with the limited cards you have. And often if a person like stumbles or finds a way to pull ahead and break out of that, they can end up winning. That's sort of the end game. Um, yeah, and then I guess finally the middle game is like the transition into the end game. So you're not quite at the part where you have to block yet, but you're maybe like a turn away from that, or depending on how you play. So this might be like presenting enough damage to put your opponent in a position where they have to start blocking on their next turn, or choosing to take enough damage that you're now in lethal range and you're going to have to start blocking. And usually in the middle game, you have a little bit of agency to figure out like, is this where we go into an end game? Do I wait a little bit to enter the end game? Like how and when do I enter the end game? And that's sort of like transition period, and thinking about if that end game is one that favors us or not, I think is super, super important and something worth talking about. So that's why we have this episode.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. How do we evaluate an end game? Like what is the things that you are looking out for to make that decision that you're either winning an end game or losing, or like how do we make that decision here?
Yeah, so I think some of it is like thinking about end games and trying before you enter the end game, trying to evaluate it in your head and going, is this a winning end game? Is this a losing end game? Is this like an even or a close end game? And I have a few people on the team that we talk about the game in this sense a lot when if we're like playing and someone's backseating. We'll talk about like, this seems like a winning end game, or this seems winning, this seems losing. We'll talk about that, and or like if I block like this, it doesn't seem winning. And I think that thinking in those terms is kind of the first step. How do you identify that? There's a number of things, and we can kind of give you some heuristics or some things to look out for that might help you understand if that end game is favorable or not. Because I really think that transitioning and like finding a way to transition into more winning end games or more even end games is a huge way to get an edge in Flesh and Blood. And if you are really good at kind of navigating both the end game itself as well as getting into a favorable end game, you can have a pretty big advantage. I think it's sort of like where the value math starts to fall apart, and where there are some like very close decisions that might be value neutral or might even be value negative, but can have a huge impact. And it's usually to do with these end game scenarios. So one thing to look out for is life totals. And what are the key life totals in certain matchups? So there's a few ways to think about this. You could think about like, what is a hero's um, damage output that they can threaten. If you're against KO can easily threaten like 12, 15 damage on 4 cards, right? Depending if he has like a might and agility. So your endgame might start early. You might have to start giving cards pretty early. If you're against, I don't know, a Bravo, most of the time Bravo can kind of do like maybe 10 or 11 damage off of a big hand. So we'll start a little bit later. You know, Uzuri might do like a dagger into a 6, so maybe about 7 damage. So kind of like imagining their damage range, and knowing when you're entering that end game is like the first step.
I see, I see. Basically, it's at a point when you're forced to start blocking if they have a full hand. Do you think that's like a good way to think about end games, or would you consider the fact that if you can rip cards from their hands as well a factor for thinking about end games as well? So like maybe like something like about their weapons, like Katsu's with their Kodachis and stuff like that?
Yeah, so it definitely goes both ways. There's like, how many cards are you taking from your opponent versus how many cards are they taking from you, and that understands kind of like that involves understanding the damage output of each of your decks. And often there's sort of key life thresholds depending on the hero that you're playing against, depending on the matchup, that you need to be aware of. So the first one is like when you're in lethal range. That means you're in an end game. But even within that, there's different kind of thresholds. So if you consider playing against a Guardian, I think as soon as you choose to go below 4 life, you're suddenly in range of a pummel. So if they have pummels left in their deck, anytime that they're representing pummel, it's potentially lethal. But if you're at 5 and you have a clean block, you're the pummel may be bad for you, but it doesn't actually kill you. Similarly, another breakpoint for Guardian is once you're at 1 HP, because at 1 HP, their hammer comes in for 4, and it's no longer taking 1 card from hand, it's taking 2 card from hand, unless you have some armor or a D-react left over. So the difference between, like, if you're at 3 HP, you can block 1 card twice before you get to that 1 HP threshold, assuming that there's 3 blocks. So you have quite a few turns where you might be able to keep 3 cards. Whereas once you're at that 1 HP threshold, you're going to have to start giving 2 cards, and that dramatically changes the type of endgame that you're in. The example you used with Katsu or Ninja and Kodachis is also a good one. Once you get to kind of like the, like 3 life total, 2 life total, the Kodachi, even if they have blues, like Kodachi 2, when you're low is really, really scary. But if you still have, let's say, 6 HP, against a good ninja hand, you're in trouble. But if you're able to keep them down to like 2 cards, like maybe their hand's like Kodachi 4, and if you have 6 HP, you leak 1 on each Kodachi, you block 3 on the 4 power attack, you take 3, you go to 3, and you still have a turn to play after only giving 1 card. So it's often kind of thinking about this, like how much damage can they present? How many cards is that going to take from you? And with your cards left over, how many cards can you take from them? And then what is their likely return from there? So you're often kind of like projecting a couple turns ahead of like, if I block like this, I go to this life total, which means I'm going to have to start giving extra cards next turn. But if I can take enough cards from my opponent, maybe that's an okay trade-off, or maybe that's a bad trade-off. And that's sort of like how you're thinking, or that's how I'm thinking about these endgames, at least.
Is there any ways to look out for this, or does this only really, can you only really learn about endgames by like playtesting and actually just playing up the matchup a couple of times to see what kind of endgame that you commonly fall into?
Yeah, I think that there's like a few ways you can do this. So one thing that I do while I'm playing, like in the match, is I will often compare different endgame states. So if I'm trying to decide between 2 lines, I'm not sure which one is better. I will often imagine that, maybe I'm considering blocking with 2 cards versus blocking with 1 card. If I block with 2 cards, I'll sort of play it out in my head. Okay, I block with 2 cards. I take 1 damage. I have 2 cards. I'm presenting 5 damage back. Is this good for me? Right? I present 5 damage back. Oh, well, maybe if I do that and they're at 6, that's actually not good enough because they get to keep 4 cards. And with 4 cards, they can probably present lethal or just kill me. So maybe that's not good enough. And maybe I need to instead only block with 1 card to start stripping cards from them. And maybe that endgame where I block with 1 card and then I'm able to, instead of presenting 5, I'm able to present 7. Maybe that's actually better. So even though like I might be trading like 3 block for 2 damage, if that 2 damage strips a card from their hand, it could be worth it. And so I'm often kind of like imagining, I block with 1 card, how many cards do I strip? And then you can even kind of go the next level of, okay, I strip 2 cards. If they have a 2 card hand, how many cards can they take from me? And you can kind of imagine it playing back and forth. So that's sort of like how I try to make decisions in endgames, is I try to think about which of those scenarios is better. Basically, I'm comparing like the 1 card block to the 2 card block to the 3 card block, and saying like which of these puts me in a position to win. It's worth noting that you're like not always you're not always favored in an endgame. Like sometimes you're at a huge disadvantage, and like it could just be a matter of, like, again, the ninja example. Sometimes just keeping your life total high enough that if they do have that, like if Katsu does whiff and draws all blues and all he can do is Kodachi 2, if you have a little bit of life to work with, that might be your out, right? You might be playing towards an endgame where you're hoping that Katsu bricks and you're kind of playing to that out of him bricking. But if you go too low on life, there's no longer an out. So ideally, like we're in a winning endgame position, but sometimes it can just be like none of these positions are good, but I'm looking for the one that is the least bad or the one that gives me the highest chance of winning, even if it is slim.
That makes sense. So I guess making a play that gets you the overall highest win percentage is always the best play. I guess that kind of just makes sense if you think about it pretty logically. I guess a good question here would be like, Does knowing what kind of end game that your deck want, is that something that you have to just like play your deck on multiple times, or is it something that we can like figure out before and like do this in during like maybe like deck building, or when we're first trying out a new hero, does this come naturally to you, or does this take a couple of games for you to figure this out for yourself, Yuki?
Often, a lot of it is based on experience playing with the deck and understanding what that looks like. Even in limited, where you maybe don't get to play with your deck, I think there may be play patterns that you notice. We kind of talked about like the Kodachi lock that comes up in WTR limited, that comes up in Outsiders limited. You think about heavy hitters limited and how, when you get to the end game and you're too low and the warriors have their attack reactions, that's how you lose, right? If they get you to, let's say, like sub 3 health or 3 health where their attack reactions are online, that's often not a winning endgame if they're able to keep even a couple cards, because you just start having to overblock everything or the attack reaction will get you. So I think that there is a lot of like, as you play test, you get a feel for these endgames and you get better at identifying them. But there is also some theory to it, so that you might know that there's certain cards that are good in endgames or certain cards that allow you to win an endgame. So, for example, we had the attack reactions and heavy hitters limited. Some CC examples that you could maybe think of as like Codex of Frailty is a huge endgame card where you can, like if you're both at one and you can block down to one card and you can Codex, force them to arsenal a card, come in for a breakpoint of 4, you're like putting them away, and then you get to ponder and you have the frailty token. Like that is often a huge swing and a way to kind of like break out of that. Like maybe you're trading 2 cards back and forth, 2 cards back and forth, and the codex can often be a way to break out of that. Lexi had 3 of a kind is another great way to break out of an endgame and kind of pull ahead. And so understanding if your deck has tools like this is really important. And similarly, understanding if your deck doesn't have tools for this, that's also important. So like Vincent comes to mind as maybe not a very good hero, but a lot of the reason she's not so strong right now, I think, is because her endgame is so weak. And the forced banish on her hero ability just basically means you always need to keep multiple cards. Like you don't have very effective 1 card plays unless you have some setup beforehand. And so often the end games for Vincent are really, really, really awkward because you start having to give too many cards and you can't actually return. And then you have blood debt and it just kind of like all falls apart. So kind of both, I guess. You get it through experience, but also understanding your deck and understanding kind of what that end game looks like, and if you have a relatively strong or relatively weak end game is all really important.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess also maybe like watching games might be a good way to like evaluate if someone's, or I think a better way of saying that would be like watching games with the objective of guessing near the end of the game, saying, "Oh, who's winning, who's losing," might be like a good way to like get yourself accustomed to like thinking about the end games a little bit more. Maybe watching stream games and before the game ends, be like, "Oh, who's winning here?" And then if you are right at, who actually wins the game, when your prediction is wrong, why that prediction was wrong, right? It might be kind of important to get better at the game, honestly, to be able to evaluate end games and why you thought they were losing, but then they actually ended up winning the game anyways in the late game scenario. And sometimes it might just be luck, right? Like Brabo might have just like ripped the crippling crush 2 turns in a row and destroyed the opponent, or like drew a perfect pummel turn, something like that. But other times that might not be the case. You thought a player was winning, and then they might end up the game being fatigued out by like an Azuri or something like that. This game is kind of tough to figure out end game scenarios most of the time, right?
Yeah, I do think that like part of the reason people have shied away from it is that it's really a complex, like talking about it is that it's a very complex topic and it's super situational, and the way that your end game interacts with one hero might be different than how it interacts with another hero, and it might depend on what cards they have in deck. Like we talked about, like the codex being a huge end game, like kind of like a way to, like, you're behind, you're behind, you're behind, how do you get back? You get back with codex, and having the knowledge of, I'm first cycle, I've seen one codex. I still have two more codexes in the deck, so this endgame is actually not bad for me. I'm pretty likely to find one. Is really important, or maybe it's the opposite. I don't have any codexes, so I can't rely on codex in my endgame, and that's also important. There's also like a lot of matchup specific stuff. So one example I can give is if you consider Bolton. Bolton is often like famously pretty bad on 2 card hands because if you do like engulfing light for 3 charged, I'm thinking like Raiden broke Bolton. You do like engulfing light for 3 charged, and they don't block and they take 3. You can't give go again unless you have snaps, and then you can't follow up with Raiden, and your 2 card 3 is not very threatening. But once they get to below 3 health and your attack starts being lethal, you actually have some like really favorable end games. Like if Bolton's like playing against a ninja and that ninja's at like 1 or 2, it's kind of a nightmare because you don't have the non-blocks, and anything you block with not only gives it +1, but also allows them to swing with the Raiden. And then if you block the Raiden, it also gets +1. So like, like if you block 3 on an engulfing light, they give it go again. You block 3 on Raiden, you're like leaking 1 on each of those. And then you're taking 2. And if you're at 2, that just means you have to give like 3 cards to their 2 card hand. And it can often be really terrible for you. But by comparison, that same endgame against like a Dromai can be super unfavored because you throw the engulfing light and they just block with a invoke whatever dragon, and they just kind of laugh at you. They go, oh, I don't care because I can just block it without turning on your Bolton hero ability. So often the way that your endgame interacts with the opponent's endgame is important to know, and that is definitely part of playtesting. Is if I get to a scenario where trading 2 card hands back and forth, is that good for me? That's something that you should know, right? Because if you win the majority of games where you're trading 2 cards back and forth, you want to get the game to that state. You're trying to that can be your win condition. I need to get the game to where we keep trading 2 cards back and forth, and then my Bolton hero ability pulls me ahead, my Codex of Frailty pulls me ahead, whatever it is, my Kodachis pull me ahead. Or actually, that's a losing end game for me. I need to make sure I don't let my opponent get me to that game state where I'm super unfavored. So I think it's not something that you can just like do overnight or be good at overnight. But as Jay said, if you're thinking about this as you watch your games, thinking about this as you play your games and trying to evaluate it on the fly, I think you'll find that you get better and better at this. And my guess is that even if this is sort of like a new concept or terminology to you, you probably are doing some of this already. You're probably kind of thinking about end games, and if you're ahead or if you're behind, you probably have like a little bit of intuition around that already just from having played the game, because everybody gets to end games and everybody has to, I think it's one of the most exciting parts of Flesh and Blood when you're trading back and forth and you have low resources and it feels kind of like a scrappy fight. It's something really fun about the game, and I think everybody has experience there, even though it's also very challenging and contextual.
One more thing I want to talk about might be cards that like kind of break these like in game scenarios. I think like a common card that I like in very grindy matchups is cards like Sigil of Solace. That card is insane, right? Like it kind of like takes your spot from like, oh, you thought it was gonna be an end game scenario, and then they play 2 Sigil of Solace, gaining 6 life. They're now not in a position where they have to block anymore, so they can actually get out of the situation. And similarly, a card is like Heart of Iandel. That card doesn't see that much play right now, but when it does, it's usually used to get to a spot where you were low and then now you're no longer low. And in pitch stack scenarios, these cards can really shine. And I think that's why these cards are really good.
Yeah, that's all very well said. I think that there are a lot of cards that are super super important there. Another one can even just be like D-reacts. Like a D-react in Arsenal is functionally sort of like the Sigil of Solace as well, right? Like it doesn't increase your life total, but it can allow you to make an extra block, and that's often why I mean I'm sure many people have done this, but that's often why you might see players as they get close to the end game kind of thumb through their opponent's discard and see what they have, and maybe think back to what they've seen pitched and go, do they still have pummels? Do they still have sink belows? Like what things are left in their deck that are kind of these key endgame cards, because often these reaction speed things can sort of surprise your opponent on either end, right? You have extra block that you otherwise wouldn't have, or you have this extra attack that comes over if you don't overblock, and all of those things you need to be aware of.
Yes, yes. And I think that might just be a good reason to start pitching these cards if you are going to be playing matchups that you know are going to come down to second cycle games. So a lot of the times when you're playing Guardian, there's going to be a spot where you kind of want to pitch your reactions if you don't need to use them at that spot, and you actually get a lot more mileage out from that pitching like a red sink below, or even sinking a sink below with a sink below is like very important in that matchup, because they just get more mileage in the late game than in the early game, right? Because even though you might be losing a point in the early game, you might need to think about your end game earlier than that, depending on the matchup and depending on if you actually think you need to do that to win the late game later.
Absolutely. And on that same note, here's where not only being aware of what you pitch, but being aware of your opponent's pitch is really important. And if you're able to identify this is the hand where they have the sink below, or this is the hand where they have the pummel, that's fantastic. I know that some people, some high level players are able to do that. Personally, I'm not great at that. It's something I'm still kind of struggling with, but I do definitely take note of there's a pummel in their pitch stack. When we get to second cycle, there's going to be a pummel. And even if I don't know exactly where it is, I have an idea that it's coming. And I know that, okay, I either need to kill them before we get to this end game. I need to make sure I have enough life that that pummel's not going to present lethal if they play it, or I can drag that out and try to stay out of lethal range, or maybe I can arsenal a defense reaction and set it up so that when they pummel me, I can play my D react to cover up the pummel, and then I'm safe. But you often need to have a plan for some of these kind of like end game plays that they could have. Similarly, if you know that there's like codex coming up, maybe you need to play towards having a card in your arsenal so that the codex doesn't take a card out of your hand that could be blocking otherwise.
Yeah, that's fair. The one card that I want to talk about real quick got banned recently. It's called Crown of Seeds. That card used to be my favorite card because when you do memorize your opponent's pitch stack, a lot of the times you actually can't do anything about your opponent's pitched pummel because you can't really change where your defense reaction that you pitched is in accordance to your opponent's pummel. But then when you have a Crown of Seeds, you can go like, oh, I need to bring this D reaction up, or oh, maybe I don't activate this Crown of Seeds because I don't want to bring this D reaction up. And that was like my favorite part about the old mirror back in the day. But now we can't do that anymore. I'm kind of sad.
Yeah, that was definitely a really fascinating part of the game. And there's actually like a lot of equipment, I think, that can interact with endgames in different ways. One example is like bullseye bracers for Ranger. If they have bullseye bracers, they kind of have access to this, like, if they have like a zero cost arrow, they can just like bullseye bracer, I don't know, endless arrow for 5 or whatever. Like a Azalea can also do this. And so like the difference between having bullseye bracers available or not can be the difference between if they have a one card play or not. Other than Codex, I guess Codex is always a one card play. But again, like these are the kinds of things that you ideally are thinking about is Azalea with one card, not very good unless it's Codex or unless they have a zero cost arrow and bullseye bracer. And you're kind of thinking about if those things are left, how many of them do they have? How likely is it that they have it? Can you beat that? All of those things. But often the equipments themselves have a lot of implications for how the endgame will play out if they are still on the board or.
That makes a lot of sense. Is there anything specific to maybe like limited? Because we talked a lot about constructed end games. Is there things specific to limited that might be relevant here? I guess we already talked a little bit about heavy hitters, but more in general.
It's sort of tricky because every limited set is a little bit different. But I would say that typically limited sets still have endgame patterns that arise and are important to understand. And it's just I don't even know if it's so much something to like. Sometimes it's more obvious, like thinking about Benji from Outsiders. Well, Benji has unblockable damage. If you go to like 1 or 2 against a Benji, they might just kill you with unblockable damage. That's something that you need to know. Similarly, though, or like I guess like on the other hand, there's a lot of things that are very contextual, tend to like kind of form patterns as you play it. So, as an example, Icelander and Uprising, you kind of think about like Icelander's endgame of being able to do arcane damage on your opponent's turn. Well, there's a lot of factors there, right? Do they have Arcane Barrier 1? If they do, that means that they can usually prevent like 2 damage on your one on your waning moon, one on your spell. And so like something like an ice bolt and a waning moon will present 3 and 3. So like 4 damage is your lethal range for Icelander. If you don't have Arcane Barrier, you might just die from 6 damage. And like all of those things tend to be like patterns that you start to pick up as you play the set. But I'd say the biggest thing for me at least is just like being aware of those and paying attention to them and you start to get a feel for, oh, the warrior attack reactions are really good, or oh, going to 1 against Briar is pretty scary because there's not really ways to prevent arcane damage, and then they just do 1 arcane and you just lose. All of those kinds of things like tend to come up repeatedly within the set. Do you have anything to add to that for limited? Anything that I maybe missed?
I think a very common one would be like, I hear a lot of people in our community at least say, in formats where Kodachis exist, never go to 2, right? Like, you just can't go to 2 because if you ever go to 2, you kind of lose the game. The Kodachis are so valuable in limited because it's so easy to trigger that if you're at 2, a blue just rips at least a card from your hand, and if you're at 1, it rips 2 cards out of your hand, and it's an unwinnable game state kind of thing unless you're also playing Kodachi and your opponent's at 1. So I think playing the game, at least in limited, once you play a couple of games a couple of times, you kind of find these like life totals that you can't be. And I think you said that really well with like the Icelander example. If you don't have AB, you can't, like, 6 is like a life total they can easily kill you at, or like even 7 sometimes. You kind of need to know that, oh, if this attack that Icelander's playing like a regular attack, and if I don't block it, I go to 6, is good or bad for me. That's clearly bad for you, and you just need to know what that number is, and that only comes from, I think, playing the format a little bit. And it's kind of tough to do this for your first like 3 or 4 drafts, but like maybe after like draft 5, draft 6, or at least talking with people who's played the format, you know what that life total is against specific matchups. And in this game, because there are a lot of things that don't change, and most of that would be your weapon, at least in limited. So you really just need to know how much that weapon typically attacks for. And in heavy hitters, that would be Mandible Claws for 3. So you kind of don't want to be at 3 or less. The Guardian weapon is also 3, so you kind of don't want to be at 3. But 4 is actually kind of okay, even against Guardian in heavy hitters, because their weapon it's so hard for their weapon to attack for 4, and if they can attack for 4, it's typically using another card. So I feel like knowing what the average like damage that their weapon does, and if you can block it and how easily you can block it, is very important in just like figuring out end games in your first couple of drafts. Just like look at the weapon, how much damage can it do, how easily can it get go again, is like the 2 things I think I would look out for.
And then I think the way that you can build up from there is build out like their 2 card plays, their 3 card plays as well. And that will give you a range also. So, like in heavy hitters, what do 2 card plays do? Well, we talked about the 2 card sevens, right? The 3 for 7. So you pitch a blue, you attack for 7. So if you are at 4, so if you're considering a line where you're going to block and you're going to go to 4 or less life and your opponent can keep 2 cards, you have to be has to be on your radar that they might throw a 7 and you might have to give 2 cards. Like that's something that by choosing to go to 4, you are sort of and leaving them with 2 cards on your return, you're sort of understanding that you might have to give 2 cards on your next block. And that's something that you could kind of like be aware of. And then you can kind of figure out like what is a likely 3-card hand's damage output and so on. And I think that often by kind of building like the 1-card hand with a weapon, the efficient 2-card hands, the efficient 3-card hands, and sort of getting a feel for each of those is a great way to kind of build this up. And it's actually the same thing in CC as well, right? It's just understanding like, Bravo on 1 card does Anathos for 4. Bravo on 2 cards does CNC for 6 or Anathos for 6. Bravo on 3 cards can like Spinal Crush for 9 or like do like a blue Choke Slam for 8. And then 4 cards, you start getting to Crippling Crush. And then obviously if they have like Tunic and Seismic Surge, there's like other things they can do.
And
But that's
dominate.
sort of, yeah. It does get complicated, but I think that, thinking about like 1 card versus 2 card versus 3 cards is like something I find myself doing a lot and is like really, really important. And sometimes, especially in constructed, can depend on the cards left in deck too. Oh, they don't have any spinals and their tunic's not up. Okay, they probably don't have very many good 3-card plays. That's something that is like super important to understand.
Players that can do that is very annoying because sometimes if they know you can't have a good 3-card hand, they might not try and rip your hand apart. They might decide to arsenal or cards, so then their next turn after that is much bigger, forces me to block. And if you are thinking about this is like a kind of thing that can step you up from like a player that's gonna be, top 8ing PQs a lot to winning PQs a lot. Once you start to win PQs, your next goal will be to like, how do I get results at PQs? And these are the thing that these like high level pro tour players are playing. This is what they're thinking about when they are playing the game. So if you only think about like the early game and the middle game and like just like how to maximize your value, this is probably like the major spot at least that you might be falling behind on, is thinking about the end game and like when you're thinking about the end game. Because typically once you're already in the end game, it's kind of too late, right? Like you can't do anything about your situation once you're there. So you have to think about it just before it. So like in the middle game, or even, in some matchups in the early game, you have to start thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, and to add to that, something that has come up for me, I think it came up for me at this most recent PQ. Unfortunately, I can't think of the exact example, but something that does come up often is I might be considering like, okay, I've blocked with 2 cards. I know I'm blocking with 2 cards because like all I can do is, I don't know, throw this pack hunt, and I have a might token, so this pack hunt comes in for 7. And my question is, do I throw this pack hunt for 7 or do I block for 6? Sometimes like just having that understanding of like what a winning endgame or a losing endgame looks like could be really important, because you go, well, yes, 7 is bigger than 6, but if I throw the 7 here and I give my opponent 4 cards, I can't win this game. Like my chances of winning this game are so low because I don't take any cards and I'm just like too low. My life total is too low. They're going to take my hand. And if I just preserve life total, maybe I'm very unlikely to win. But if my opponent, like if it's like the KO mirror and my opponent draws all blues and they swing 5, well, if I haven't gone super low, I can actually maybe keep cards and have a comeback, and that's how I can get back into the game. And so sometimes it's really about just thinking like, this spot's really bad for me, but I know that this endgame loses for sure, and this other endgame has some chance of winning. Like even if that chance of winning is like my opponent bricking, but you're giving yourself that opportunity to let your opponent brick. And this is like sometimes why like people will be like, wow, the good player got so lucky. A lot of it is like they're identifying these spots of like, I can't go into this endgame because I'm so likely to lose. I just need a block. And like, yeah, these blocks kind of suck. Yeah, I'm falling behind, but by avoiding this scenario where I know I'm losing, I'm at least giving myself some kind of out to win in the future. So yeah, I think just like really understanding like what a bad end game looks like can also be really important, because you can be like, well, I can't take this play because if I go to this situation, I'm just like so unfavored, kind of a thing.
This just came back into my head, but another thing to think about would be, how easy is that deck, or can that deck convert 4-card hands? It's kind of very important because sometimes decks can't convert 4 card hands easily, mostly unlimited. Go again is not a mechanic that's being printed onto a lot of cards, at least in heavy hitters, that sometimes blocking out and not attacking your opponent and letting them convert a block card is very valuable because, like, sometimes you leave Guardian with 4 card hand and all they can do is attack for 7. And giving them a 4 card 7 and you like losing out some value by not attacking is fine because you prevented them from converting their cards as well. So then you can preserve your own life totals in both ways. You overblocked and you got extra value from devaluing your opponent's hand as well. I think it's something that's kind of hard to do because sometimes they convert 4 cards and you get extremely punished. But if that's your only way to win, it's sometimes you have to do that.
Yeah, I think that's all very well said. And again, this tends to come up more in the endgame scenarios where you have fewer options, right? Typically, it's not. Typically, you don't take these types of risks in the early game because you just do the most efficient thing in the early game. But sometimes, as you start getting to the middle to the end game, is when it can make sense to do these. Usually not like hugely inefficient plays, but sometimes like slightly inefficient plays. Like if you're considering like blocking 6 and sending 12, like you should probably send 12. But often if it's like close, like you're like, this is value neutral, or I'm giving up like 1 or 2 points, it can sometimes be correct. And it's usually in these endgame scenarios.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Anything else you want to add on to about the end games?
I don't think so. I think that more or less kind of sums it up. So maybe I can just do like a really quick recap of kind of like the things that we talked about because I feel like there was a lot in this episode and hopefully we did it justice. I think it's a tough topic to cover, but we did our best. The first thing is start thinking about your end games. What does a winning end game look like? Who is ahead or who is behind, or is it even? And what kinds of cards could swing it either way? Pay attention to those key life totals in the matchup where, like Pummel is lethal or the Kodachis are a huge threat or, like whatever it is, you're at risk of dying to Icelanders, Waning Moon, and Spell. Pay attention to all of that. When you're making decisions in your end games or in your middle game that is like transitioning into an end game, think about comparing those different states. So imagine that you do the block and you send the attack for 7. How many cards does it rip? What can your opponent return? Are you favored in that scenario? And compare it to your other line where maybe you block with one more card and figure out which one seems the most favorable to you. And then finally, as you play a limited format or as you learn a CC matchup, try to understand what a winning or losing endgame for your hero is based on that matchup. So we kind of gave the example of like Bolton below 3 health versus a ninja who can't help but turn on his hero ability versus like Dromai, who is very good at turning off his hero ability. Those things are different. So you need to understand not only like winning and losing end games, but also contextual on the matchup as well. And that kind of applies to both CC as well as limited. All right. Hopefully this was helpful, and I hope that you all enjoyed it. Wishing you all of you the best of luck at your PQs that you have coming up. If you have any questions about endgames or anything else, to be honest, feel free to reach out to us. You can do so via the Patreon Discord, on our YouTube video and comments, or on social media. Jay is at UetaJ, and I'm at YukiLeeBender on Twitter. And we also have an email on thebobble@gmail.com where you can send your questions and feedback directly there. And until next time, good luck and have a good night.
So sign off. I just want to talk about the Canadian McDonald's Happy Meal toy right now. Have you been getting or is interested in these Happy Meal toys? And what these are Yu-Gi-Oh! Hello Kitty collab toys. And a bunch of my friends who, most of them play TCGs, so a lot of them like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or at least liked Yu-Gi-Oh! When they were a kid. And we have these like Hello Kitty Yu-Gi-Oh! Collab toys now, and they're kind of nice and collectible.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. Um, Personally, I don't have like a huge attachment to them, but I laughed when you said it because um, my roommate Eli was excited about them and he really wanted it. And so we actually went to Ellie and I, so my girlfriend and I went to McDonald's after Armory to pick something up for Eli. And so we got him a Happy Meal, and he opened exactly the one that he wants. So we only got like one Happy Meal, and he got exactly the one that he wants. He opened the Pom Pom Pren, and he was like super happy about it. And I was like joking that he opened the Fabled.
Yeah, it's really funny is that at least my group of friends is trying to collect like one of each of them. So I think there's
Mhm.
like 12. I think there's 12. Um but
I think so.
but mainly it's very difficult to get all 12 because at least from our knowledge so far, if you
Oh
go
no, there's
to
10. There's 10.
there's 10, okay. But if you go to a McDonald's right now, um, even if you order like 5 Happy Meals, they won't actually have different versions of these toys at that location. They typically only have one. So like if you go to a McDonald's, a block away, they might only have the Exodia one. But then if you go to the one, across the city, they'll have the Dark Magician one. So what we actually have to do, at least our friend group, is we'll be like, which toy does your McDonald's have? Oh, okay. Can you buy me like 5 Happy Meals? So then we have one for each of the guys, and then we go to like, oh, this one is the same as that one, so we don't have to go to this McDonald's. We have to go to another
Mhm.
McDonald's, and we're doing these like scavenger hunt esque thing of like going around and buying like 5, 6 Happy Meals with like 20-year-old grown ass men just buying up 5 or 6 Happy Meals at a time. It's kind of sick.
That's pretty funny. I also know that like some of them just are either out or like they only have the old toys. They don't have the new toys. I think that happened after Armory on Monday. Eli was gonna go buy a Happy Meal, and then he like came back super fast. And we're like, wow, that was quick. Oh wait, you don't have anything. And he's like, yeah, they only had the old toys.
It's so funny.
So they just like didn't order anything. It's so funny. Yeah, and when we went through the drive-through, my first question was like, do you have the Yu-Gi-Oh toys? And they're like, no, but we have Hello Kitty toys. And we're like, yeah, 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 that one, that one.
It's so funny. The one of my friends was coming over to my place and went through a drive-through McDonald's, ordered 2 Happy Meals, came into my room and just like, I got scammed. They didn't have the Yu-Gi-Oh ones.
That's why you got to ask at the drive-through.
Yeah, they did it. They just assumed that it was gonna be, the Yu-Gi-Oh
Mm,
toys, and they're just like, no, we got the old toys. You can have them, give it to your nephews or something like that. So yeah, I just have like a stack of random non-Yu-Gi-Oh toys as well, just to give out to my niece and nephews when they come over now.
that's so funny. Yeah. We'll see. I have a feeling I may wind up back at McDonald's. I think Ellie wants to try and get one. I'm not sure which one. Maybe I should ask, and she can get the get the info of like which one is at which McDonald's, and we
Yeah,
can
yeah. It's
try and get her that one because she lives in Texas, so they don't have them.
Yeah, this is these toys used to be European exclusive, and they
Yeah,
finally came to Canada here. So I don't think the U.S. has any access to these. And what's really funny is we also figured out that they came in waves. So the first wave was like Slifer, Dark Magician, Exodia, and Blue Eyes. And the second wave now is Dark Magician Girl, Time Wizard, and we actually don't know the other two yet because the shipment should be coming in today and tomorrow for the other McDonald's. So we would need to go around and find the managers of those McDonald's and ask them which toy they got.
that's so incredible. I like how this is enough of a thing that like when you asked me when you were talking about how many there are and I knew that there was 10, it was because I looked at my web browser and I was like, oh, I have a tab open because I was looking at this earlier today because I wanted to look at what they looked like. So it's like a thing. Like it's enough of a thing. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, man, McDonald's putting these TCG players to go to McDonald's and buy a bunch of Happy Meals now. Oh, good marketing. Good marketing. Good collab too. Hello Kitty Yu-Gi-Oh. Good collab. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to say.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good.